Welcome to part 5. This question is quite different and it's actually pretty unique in the set of all of the questions that the book presents us with, at least in the early stages. So this is almost like a philosophical question. We are being asked to resolve a paradox wherein for a constant rate Poisson process, the sequence of n spikes that is occurring in a given time interval, all of these sequences are equally likely. And it seems paradoxical because we do not expect all of these n spikes to appear within the first 1% of the time interval. And this may seem a little bit, at least to me, a little bit hard to grasp. But then I think that the best way to think about this is to try to answer this question in a simpler system. So I'm not going to read through all of this. You can just do that on your own time. But I'm going to discuss the other system that I think really makes it clear why this is not necessarily a paradox, and that is simply by flipping a coin. So let's simplify a little bit. Let's dispense with the Poisson process for a minute, and let's instead talk about a series of Bernoulli trials. So imagine that you're flipping a coin, and the only results that you can obtain are heads or tails on any given trial. If you do that 10 times in a row, you're going to get some distribution of heads and tails. And then you may be asking the question, well, what is the sort of expected number of heads in any given sequence? And that turns out to be 5 because we have 10 trials and the probability of getting heads is 1/2. So 1/2 times 10 is equal to 5, and that is indeed the expected value. However, the expected value is sort of like just the mean. It doesn't mean that, excuse the pun, we are always going to get 5 heads and 5 tails. Instead, that's just sort of like the most likely, most typical value. The important thing here, and this is quite subtle to consider, is that if we flip the coin on the first trial and we obtain tails, what is the probability of getting tails on the subsequent trial? It is 1/2. And that's because the previous trial's outcome has no bearing whatsoever on the probability of getting heads or tails in the next trial. So this is technically called memorylessness. So you can sort of think of it as this process doesn't have any memory of what happened on the previous trial, and the probabilities stay the same. So given that, it is equally likely that you get this sequence as getting this sequence. All sequences are equally likely. It's just that on average, you would expect to see about 5 heads and 5 tails in this sequence of 10 trials. And now just to wrap things up, let's talk again about the Poisson process. So essentially what is happening is that we are dividing time into a set of intervals which are very, very short, depending on the sort of sampling rate that we assign. And what we're doing is that we are asking at every time point the question, was there a spike at this particular time? And then we move on to the next time interval, and then we ask the same question, was there a spike? And the answer to that is either 1, yes, there was a spike, or 0, no, there was no spike. And so if you look at this, and if you just imagine a handful of bins to begin with, this sequence of spikes and non-spike events has the same probability as this sequence because the process which generates them is memoryless. In other words, the fact that there is a 1 right here doesn't change the probability of another 1 being here, and so on. So the sort of subtle difference, just to reiterate that, is that on any given run through it, all of the sequences are equally likely. However, if you just do this many, many times, the distribution of the sort of number of ones and zeros that you would get would have some specific shape, with the expected value being sort of equal to the number of bins that you have and the probability of obtaining the spikes. So to be more specific, the probability of getting a spike on any given time interval is equal to this. So this is basically the Poisson distribution, and the only difference that is here is that we multiply the lambda, so that's the mean, with t, which is the time interval. So that's the length of time in each of these bins, right? And if you remember from the last section in the code, this is exactly what we are doing here. So we assign the lambda in the Poisson process function to be equal to the sort of the firing rate multiplied with the length of time over which we are evaluating this, right? And so since the Poisson process is memoryless, the outcome in any given bin does not impact the probability of either result in the subsequent bin. And so that's how we resolve the paradox.